Hey everyone, and welcome to today's explainer. So, if you hear the phrase financial management and instantly picture endless, soul-crushing spreadsheets or, just this heavy burden of rigid math, well, you are definitely not alone. But today, we're going to completely flip that script. We're looking at the architecture of financial stewardship. We're going to discover how finance is actually this profoundly strategic tool. It's a way of deeply aligning an organization's resources with its core mission. It's really not just about tracking pennies. It's about architecting the future itself. Right off the bat, let's dive into this quote. Financial management isn't just about numbers. It's about stewardship, the way managers hold the organization's breath, its pulse, its promise. I absolutely love this because it perfectly reframes our entire subject. When we look at finance through the lens of stewardship, it instantly stops being this dry administrative task. It becomes the literal lifeblood of an organization's values. It's the flow that dictates where the organization goes and ultimately what it can achieve.
So let's get into Pillar 1, Financial Management, the pulse.
To really understand this architecture, we have to start at the foundation. The crucial point here is that financial management actually boils down to three core strategic functions. First up, investment decisions. Basically, where are we putting our resources for long-term growth? Second, financing decisions. How are we going to actually raise those funds? And third, dividend decisions. How much profit do we distribute to our people versus how much we hold on to? Now, these aren't just math problems. Let's take a small publishing house, for example. They had to choose between expanding their editorial team or dropping cash on new printing equipment. By using these financial management principles to weigh the return on investment against the risk, the founder wasn't just doing math. She was listening to the future of her company and making sure her resources backed up that vision. Let's see how this plays out when things get rough. Picture a local dairy cooperative facing a brutal cash crunch right in the middle of summer. Now the easy, reactive path, just taking out a high-interest loan and calling it a day. But through smart financial management, they chose a totally different route. Instead, they restructured the receivables, they offered early payment discounts to their retailers, and they strategically delayed all non-essential purchases. This wasn't just basic survival. It was an active, intentional strategy to preserve their independence and long-term health.
And you know what? Financial management can actually drive creativity. Take this number, a massive 30%. A local community-run cafe started using financial dashboards to track their daily sales, ingredient costs, and staff hours. Well, they noticed a really distinct dip in evening footfall. But instead of just panicking and cutting staff, they used that data to innovate. They introduced evening storytelling nights. And the result? A totally sustainable 30% increase in revenue. Financial management didn't kill their creativity. It literally hit the nail on the head, highlighting exactly where they needed to be creative to thrive.
Moving right along to see how this builds, here is Pillar 2, Capital Structure, the Mix. So, transitioning from that daily pulse of management, let's look at our overarching funding mix. By definition, capital structure is the specific mix of debt and equity that a firm uses to finance its operations and its growth. Now, classical textbook theories, like the famous Modigliani-Miller theorem, they'll tell you that under ideal, perfect market conditions, your capital structure doesn't actually affect your firm's value. But come on, we don't live in a perfect textbook world, right? Out here in reality, things like taxes, bankruptcy risks, and market perceptions matter immensely. Capital structure isn't just math. It's actually a mood. It literally dictates how investors feel about your choices and your overall stability. And there's a real, vital tension here. On one side, you have debt. Debt carries high interest, risk, and some seriously intense repayment pressure. On the flip side, equity can be super expensive because it requires giving up a piece of the pie to relational partners. A great real-world example of this tension is a textile exporter who is relying heavily on debt. When interest rates suddenly spiked, their profit margins shrank to almost zero. Their solution wasn't just to scramble for cheaper debt. Instead, they shifted gears and issued preference shares to their long-term partners. That wasn't just a financial pivot. It was a deeply relational shift that completely changed the makeup of their business. And this brilliantly illustrates how a company figures out its minimum required return, also known as the weighted average cost of capital, or WACC. Take a solar panel manufacturer that's getting ready to launch a new product line. They knew pure equity was way too expensive, but pure debt brought terrifying repayment pressure. So what did they do? They crafted this very specific hybrid model. They kept their retained earnings, they brought in founder equity, and they secured a low-interest green loan. They chose this specific mix because it directly reflected their organizational values. They were prioritizing sustainability over mere solvency. Because here's the thing, every single source of capital carries its own unique story. Just look at the funding evolution of your typical tech startup. Say they bootstrap for 2 years. Year 1, that's all founder equity. Year 2, maybe they bring in some grants. Then by year 3, they start layering their funding with convertible notes and strategic angel partnerships. Every single one of those steps, every new source of capital, fundamentally shapes the company's culture. Basically, who you take money from dictates the voices in the room, and that completely changes the trajectory of a growing business. All right, that brings us to pillar 3, budgeting, the compass.
Okay, so we've looked at the daily pulse, and we've mapped out where the money actually comes from. Now let's shift gears to how we intentionally plan its future use. And hey, if you're someone who absolutely dreads budgeting, please remember this. A budget is not a cage, it's a compass. Budgeting is simply the process of creating a financial plan for a defined period of time, and budgetary control is just monitoring your performance against that plan. It is entirely about direction. It's about guidance. It is absolutely not about restriction or locking you away from future opportunities. Now, to truly use a budget as a compass, a lot of organizations are turning to something called zero-based budgeting. This is a method where every single expense has to be justified from scratch for each new period. You don't just take last year's budget, slap an extra 5% on it, and call it a day. Nope, you start at absolute zero. It is, without a doubt, the ultimate tool for financial intentionality. Let's really contrast these two approaches. Traditional budgeting leans heavily on assumptions carried over from historical data. But zero-based budgeting, it forces you to stop and ask, wait, what do we actually need right now? What could we do differently today? There was this nonprofit group that used this exact zero-based method to plan their annual outreach. By flat-out refusing to just assume last year's costs were automatically necessary, they ended up creating a far leaner, way more responsive program that actually served their community significantly better. Now, what's really interesting here is how we tend to frame budgetary control. When a school's science lab ended up exceeding its budget, the traditional punitive response would be to just slash their funding right then and there, or halt their experiments entirely. But by using smart budgetary control, the school tracked spending across all their departments, found some underused areas, and dynamically reallocated those funds while introducing shared resources. Control, in this case, wasn't a punishment at all. It was intelligent, real-time adaptation.
Let's look at one final amazing example of this kind of intentionality. A local theater group was planning a massive festival. Using zero-based budgeting, every single line item on their sheet, we're talking from the ridiculously expensive stage lighting all the way down to the backstage snacks, was debated and justified. They had to prove that every single dollar directly aligned with the ultimate purpose of the festival. So it wasn't just about being stingy or efficient with their cash, it was about ensuring absolute fidelity to their artistic vision. The whole shebang had to have a purpose. Which brings us to our conclusion: structure, story, and faith. We have covered a lot of ground today, right? From the daily management pulse to the overarching capital structure to the guiding compass of budgeting. So let's bring all these philosophical threads together to see the complete architecture. I really want to leave you with this final profound thought from the source material. Structure is not just scaffolding, it's story. And sources are not just funds, they're faith. The numbers you punch into a spreadsheet, the mix of debt and equity you choose, the way you allocate your hard-earned budget, these aren't just sterile, boring business mechanics. They genuinely tell the true story of your business's values. The sources of capital you trust are a literal testament to what you have faith in. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a few deeply personal questions to really challenge how you view your own financial stewardship moving forward. Ask yourself, what structures actually shape my decisions? When I need resources, how do I choose my sources? What does budgeting really mean to me? Am I letting it be a cage, or have I turned it into a compass? And ultimately, how do I balance financial discipline with future possibility? Take these questions, chew on them, apply them to your own work, and start building your own architecture of financial stewardship today. Thanks for joining us.